issued a ruling that instantly stripped the president of the authority he had been using to wage it. In a 6-3 decision, the court blocked the executive branch from imposing sweeping new tariffs under an emergency statute that, until that moment, had powered one of the most aggressive trade strategies in modern history. The majority opinion was calm, almost restrained, but its impact was immediate and undeniable. The statute does not authorize the imposition of these tariffs. With that sentence, billions of dollars in planned duties were frozen. The emergency authority that had justified them was declared insufficient. The trade war, at least in its current form, had hit a constitutional wall. For months, the administration had relied on a decades-old emergency economic powers law to impose tariffs on strategic imports, arguing that chronic trade imbalances and foreign economic practices posed a national security threat. Under that declaration, tariff rates were raised, expanded, and threatened again as leverage in ongoing negotiations. Markets adjusted, global supply chains recalibrated, foreign governments responded with retaliatory measures. The strategy was clear: pressure through taxation at the border. But the Supreme Court did not weigh the wisdom of that strategy. It weighed the legality of the power behind it. And it concluded that Congress had not clearly granted the executive branch the authority to impose tariffs of this magnitude under the statute cited. Article 1 of the Constitution vests the power to lay and collect taxes and duties in Congress. While Congress may delegate certain powers, the court emphasized that such delegation must be explicit when it carries vast economic consequences. Tariffs, the majority noted implicitly, are taxes. And taxes require unmistakable legislative authorization. At 10:04 a.m., that authorization was deemed absent. Inside the White House, the ruling landed mid-meeting. Senior advisors were gathered to discuss the next phase of tariff escalation, including a new tranche of duties scheduled to take effect within weeks. An aide entered quietly, phone in hand, and passed it to the chief of staff. The room shifted almost instantly. Screens were refreshed, copies of the opinion were requested. The phrase from the ruling, "does not authorize," was read aloud. For a moment, there was silence, because the implications were not narrow, they were structural. The tariffs currently in place were not immediately erased, but all pending expansions were halted. Billions of dollars in planned duties projected to generate significant revenue and apply pressure in negotiations were suspended. Federal agencies were instructed to pause implementation of any new tariff actions tied to the emergency authority. The legal foundation had cracked. Markets reacted within minutes. The Dow Jones Industrial Average swung sharply as traders absorbed the news. Shares of multinational manufacturers rose on expectations of reduced trade friction, while domestic producers that had benefited from tariff protections dipped. Treasury yields edged lower as investors sought short-term safety. Currency markets fluctuated as global traders reassessed U.S. trade leverage. It was not chaos, it was recalibration. The scale of the blocked tariffs underscored the gravity of the moment. The administration had announced plans to expand duties across multiple sectors, targeting hundreds of billions of dollars in imported goods. Those tariffs were not symbolic. They were the backbone of a broader economic negotiation strategy aimed at reshaping trade relationships and pressuring foreign governments into concessions. Now, that backbone had been weakened by constitutional constraint. The dissenting justices warned that limiting executive flexibility during economic crises could undermine national leverage, but the majority held firm. Emergency language in a statute, they argued, cannot be stretched to cover sweeping tariff authority without clear congressional voice. The court did not say the president cannot wage a trade war, it said he cannot do so under this interpretation of emergency power. That distinction matters, and it reshapes the battlefield, because if tariffs imposed through emergency authority are blocked, the administration must either seek new legislation from Congress or find narrower statutory pathways. Both options require negotiation. Both dilute unilateral leverage. The immediate shock was legal. The secondary shock was strategic. The trade war had been driven by speed and executive discretion. Now it faces procedural friction and judicial oversight. At 10:04 a.m., the trade war did not end diplomatically. It ended constitutionally. The Supreme Court did not weigh in on economic theory or geopolitical tactics. It enforced a boundary, and in doing so, it froze a strategy that had defined months of policy. The tariffs were blocked. The emergency was contained, and a new question emerged almost instantly. If tariffs fall, what happens to the trade war strategy? The shock of the ruling was immediate. The reasoning behind it was deliberate. To understand why the Supreme Court blocked the tariffs, you have to step away from the headlines and into the structure of constitutional power, because this was never just about trade. It was about authority. For months, the administration relied on a decades-old emergency economic powers statute, a law designed during the Cold War to allow presidents to respond swiftly to extraordinary foreign threats. Under that statute, once a national emergency is declared, the president may regulate certain economic transactions involving foreign entities. Historically, it has been used to freeze assets, impose sanctions, and restrict financial flows tied to terrorism or hostile states. It was not written specifically as a tariff tool, but the administration interpreted its language broadly. The argument was strategic. Chronic trade imbalances, foreign subsidies, and industrial overcapacity were framed as national security risks. Economic dependency was presented as vulnerability. The emergency declaration cited systemic trade deficits and supply chain exposure as justification for aggressive tariff escalation. Under that theory, the statute's authority to regulate foreign commerce included the power to impose sweeping import duties across entire sectors. The White House defended this interpretation as necessary and urgent. Congress moved slowly, global markets move fast. If the United States needed leverage in negotiations, the executive branch had to act decisively. That was the logic. And for a time, it held. Tariffs were imposed. Retaliation followed. Negotiations intensified. The trade war strategy relied heavily on that unilateral flexibility. But the Supreme Court approached the issue differently. The majority did not evaluate whether trade imbalances posed real risks. It did not assess whether tariffs were economically wise. Instead, it examined whether Congress had clearly granted the president the authority to impose taxes of this magnitude under the cited statute. And here, the court turned to the major questions doctrine. Over the past several years, the Supreme Court has reinforced a principle that when an executive agency claims authority over issues of vast economic and political significance, the statute authorizing that power must speak clearly. Ambiguous or general language is not enough to justify sweeping transformation. The tariffs at issue affected hundreds of billions of dollars in trade. They reshaped global supply chains. They influenced domestic prices and corporate earnings. That scale, the court argued, placed the case squarely within major questions territory. The statute's reference to regulating economic transactions during emergencies did not explicitly mention tariff authority at this level, and that absence mattered. The majority opinion returned repeatedly to Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress holds the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Tariffs are duties, duties are taxes. That authority is foundational. While Congress may delegate aspects of trade regulation to the executive branch, such delegation must be unmistakable when it involves taxation. The court concluded that the emergency statute did not contain that unmistakable language. The statute does not authorize the imposition of these tariffs, the opinion stated plainly. That sentence was not rhetorical, it was structural. It meant that the entire tariff expansion rested on an interpretation the court found unsupported by Congress. The dissent argued that economic emergencies evolve and that Congress intended flexibility. But the majority responded by drawing a constitutional line. Emergency does not override separation of powers. The urgency of a situation does not grant the executive branch independent authority to tax without explicit legislative backing. That principle is not new, but its application here carried historic weight. The court did not reject the trade war. It rejected how it was built. That distinction defines the legal bombshell. The administration remains free to pursue aggressive trade negotiations. It may seek congressional approval for tariffs. It may rely on other, narrower statutory authorities that specifically address trade practices, but it cannot rely on broad emergency language to justify expansive taxation. The decision reshapes not only this policy, but the interpretation of executive economic power more broadly. For decades, presidents have tested the elasticity of delegated authority during crises. Sometimes courts have deferred, sometimes they have constrained. In this case, the court chose constraint, and it did so with clarity. The ruling signals that emergency statutes are not blank checks. When authority touches the core of congressional power taxation, the delegation must be explicit. Anything less risks imbalance. The shock of the decision lies not in its drama, but in its precision. It did not shout. It did not accuse. It applied doctrine. And in applying that doctrine, it halted one of the most consequential trade strategies of the modern era. The tariffs were blocked not because trade disputes disappeared, but because the legal bridge supporting them was deemed insufficient. The crisis may persist, the strategy may evolve, but the constitutional boundary has been redrawn. At 10:05 a.m., 60 seconds after the Supreme Court ruling hit the public docket, trading algorithms began recalculating risk. By 10:07, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had swung sharply, first downward on shock, then upward as traders attempted to price in the sudden freeze of tariff escalation. It wasn't a clean reaction. It was volatile, jagged, uncertain. Because this was not simply a policy shift, it was a